Hi, today we're going to start studying normal distributions. So I'm starting out here to introduce you to the idea and try to explain what normal distributions are. So this first video here, I'm trying to give you the big picture, the what and the why behind what we're going to be doing in this chapter. And then later on, I'll get into the how you actually do the things that I'll be asking you to do with normal distributions. So, in the last chapter, we were talking about probability distributions and random variables, and we focused on discrete random variables, like the number of heads that come up if you flip 4 coins, or the number of red lights you have to stop at on your way to work, or the number of TVs in a household, or the number of children a randomly selected adult has, or the number of people out of 100 randomly selected people who prefer Coke to Pepsi. So these are all examples of discrete variables because they count how many of something there are. And it has to be a whole number, and because of that we can list all the possible values. But now in this chapter we're going to be working with continuous variables, like, for example, the height of how tall somebody is, the height of a randomly selected adult man or adult woman, the weight of a 10-year-old boy or girl, the speed of a pitched baseball, the temperature of a lake, the number of calories in a piece of cake. Now, all of these are continuous variables because they're not separate individual discrete things that appear one at a time and you can count how many there are. Instead, they're somewhere along a scale. Depending on how precisely you measure them, they might be reported as whole numbers, but they might not. They might have fractional parts after the decimal point. So like the number of calories, yeah, we usually talk about a whole number of calories, and we sometimes talk about counting calories, but the actual calorie content of a piece of cake is something that a scientist might measure in a lab. So these are continuous variables. They don't have to be whole numbers, and we're not going to be able to individually list all the possible values. Well, this man could be 5'3" inches and 7/8. This man could be 6 feet 2.689 inches. If we want to really break it down, we can't really list all the possibilities individually. So let's talk about heights of adult men as an example. Every man, his height is somewhere along a scale. It might be 72 inches. So one particular man might be exactly 72 inches tall, which means 6 feet, because each foot is 12 inches, so 6 times 12 is 72. Another man might be 63.5 inches. So that would be 5 foot 3.5 inches tall. Another man might be 79.2 inches. Another man might be 69 inches, which would put him right at the average. So, at least according to what I've found online, the mean or average height of adult men in the United States is 69 inches, which would be 5 feet and 9 inches tall. And the standard deviation is 3 inches, and heights are normally distributed. That is, they follow a normal distribution, and I'm going to try to explain what that means. What does it mean that they are normally distributed? Now, these things that I've got listed here, they may or may not be exactly accurate. The average height might not be exactly 69 inches. It might be a little more or a little less than that, but we'll work with this and kind of assume that these things are all accurate. So what does it mean to be normally distributed? It means that the distribution follows a curve that has this kind of a shape. Now, this graph that we're looking at, imagine it as kind of a smoothed out version of a histogram or a frequency polygon. So how high up we are above a point on the horizontal axis, the higher up we go to get to a point on the curve, the higher the frequency, the more of that particular data value there are. And notice the general shape of this curve. It's highest in the middle, and then it sort of tapers down on either side. And this is sometimes called a bell curve or a bell-shaped curve because it's kind of shaped like a bell. So this would be a bell curve or a normal curve. And this particular curve is highest right in the middle where the 69-inch point goes. So that means that there are more men who are 69 inches tall than any other height. That's the most common height for adult men in the United States. And notice that the curve is the same height above the number 65 as it is above the number 73. So that's showing you that a height of 65 inches is equally as common as a height of 73 inches. There are the same number of men or the same percentage of men who are 65 inches tall as who are 73 inches tall. And then there are more men who are 73 inches tall than there are who are 74 inches tall. 73 is a more common height than 74. It's got a greater frequency. So there are more men who are 6'1" than who are 6'2". And if you look at something like 80 inches, it looks like the curve isn't up there at all. It looks like it's right down there on the horizontal axis, and really it's not quite touching the axis. If we zoomed way in, we would see that we're still at least a little bit above that. So there are a few men who are 80 inches tall, which would be 6'8". That's pretty tall. That's not very common at all. There are not very many men who are 6'8", but there are a few. Now, when we talk about how high the curve is above a particular point on the scale, what does that tell us? Well, how do we interpret that? What's the scale? What does it mean that it's this tall? Well, actually, with a continuous variable like this, we don't really care about the height of the curve. Because a question like, how many men are 65 inches tall, or what percentage of men are 65 inches tall, isn't really the right question to ask. With a continuous variable, how do you distinguish between somebody who's 65 inches versus somebody who's 65.1 inches or 64.98 inches tall? How close to exactly 65 do you have to be before you count as being 65 inches tall? So with a continuous variable like this, we don't talk about specific numbers so much as we talk about a range of numbers. So we might ask a question like, what percentage of men are between 64.5 and 65.5 inches tall? So that way there's no question. Somebody who's 65 or 65.1 does get counted. So we have a range of values like that, and then everybody either is or is not somewhere in that range. And we want to know, okay, what percentage of men fall in that range? Or we might say, what percentage of men are less than 65 inches tall? Or what percentage of men are greater than 65 inches tall? Everybody is either shorter than that or taller than that. If you really get down to it, somebody who's exactly 65, well, measure a little more precisely, and you'll see there may be a hair above or a hair below that. So you can divide everybody up into the ones who are taller and the ones who are shorter than 65 inches. And the way we answer questions like that is, well, we can write it like this: P of 64.5 less than X less than 65.5. The P you can think of as standing for either probability or for proportion or percentage. So this would mean either what's the probability of a randomly selected man being between 64.5 and 65.5 inches tall, or what proportion or what percentage of all men are between 64.5 and 65.5 inches tall. And the answer to that question corresponds to the area of this blue shaded region. So if we find where 64.5 is and find where 65.5 is on the scale here, and then draw lines at those points up to the curve, and then shade in the region in between those two lines, how big is that region? How much space does it take up? How much of the total area is contained in that blue region there? And it turns out that it's about 5.5% of the total area, which means that about 5.5% of men have a height that falls in that range between 64.5 and 65.5 inches. What percentage of men are less than 65 inches tall? Well, if we draw a line at the 65-inch mark, and then the ones that are less than that would be everybody over here to the left of 65 on the scale. And if we shade in that region, everything to the left of 65 here, and then we look at how much space is shaded, how much of the total area under this curve is shaded in red here, it turns out to be about 9.1%. So that means that about 9.1% of all U.S. adult men are less than 65 inches tall. And then the other 90.9% of them are greater than 65 inches tall. So the probability of X being greater than 65, or the proportion of men whose height is greater than 65, corresponds to this area of this shaded region, the part of the graph that's to the right of the 65-inch mark. And that is 90.9% of the whole thing.